CEOs est venu this morning in one of the conversations, I think, in the other room. So really doesn't need any introduction other than you're a professor at INSEAD as well as the co-founder of Tremont with Louis Victor, if he is in the room, there in the back. And one of the things, as mentioned in the morning session, the keynote, is really we want to end the day to shift the focus a little bit and talk about the governance of trust and safety and the importance of how we can integrate this into the business that we're all in and getting the attention of senior management and other individuals and organizations. So we thought this would be a good way to close an amazing day. I hope you all enjoyed it. Well, we'll pass it over to Theos.
Thank you so much. I'm not sure it's going to be a good way to close, but I'm going to try my best. It's great to be here again and share some thoughts on something extremely important. Just briefly, I've been working in the space of technology and business for about 25 years now. And I also mentioned in the morning in the panel that it's amazing that it's been only a few years now, 7 years, that we started talking, maybe, well, of course, some people earlier than others, but at least now it's becoming really a hot topic, let's say, talking about potential risks we can create with these technologies, or that the technologies create in case of AI, for example. So it's pretty surprising, and in many ways, one of the messages I will try to share is that, unfortunately, history repeats. And the question then is, what the heck are we learning, right? And can we do it better? And what are the main messages? What's the main lesson here? The main lesson is basically a one line. Nothing will succeed, no matter what tools and processes we have in place, unless we put in place strong governance. That's it. That's the message. Of course, the word governance is loaded. It can mean 1,000 things. I'm working on this topic from a lot of different angles. Here is one example angle that's interesting. When you talk to tech entrepreneurs about governance, they get an allergy. And the main reason we find from our discussion with tech entrepreneurs, and there's actually a video coming out on INSEAD this week about this topic, for those of you interested, the main reason is that they misunderstand what it means. They think governance is like bureaucracy and boards and corporate governance, which is not necessarily. There is the right type of governance for the right type of organization. You don't want to be heavy, you don't need to be heavy early on as a startup. And of course, if you're a public company, it's a different story. And governance of regulators in the regulatory space is also a different story. So governance can mean many things. And we have to avoid being confused and misunderstanding this and therefore developing allergies to this. Because, as I said, the main message I want to say today is something that we all know, which is there is no way we will succeed, no matter what tools we use, unless we sort out governance properly. Having said this, the word sorting out governance properly is also a challenging word because there is no such thing as optimal governance. And we should never aim for this because we'll never find it. Governance is supposed to be a better than today situation, a middle ground between all sorts of different trade-offs that I'll discuss. And it's more of an art than a cookbook. That's very important because then you don't get disappointed if it doesn't work sometimes. It's not meant to work all the time. It's meant to work more times. That's more or less the keynotes. And just to say first things first, my three main messages, just to generalize now a bit more. Are we at the beginning of building a global digital crisis? I'm taking the term from global financial crisis, right? GFC, GDC. Are we building that? Have we been building that for the past 25 years, if not 50 or whatever it is? Question mark. And I'm afraid it's not unlikely. Maybe we're already in the middle of this, and we've seen lots of issues. Second point is, as I mentioned, financial, climate, digital, and I'll put all three together because I think they are probably the global financial crisis that we all remember, or at least most of us remember, was probably nothing compared to neither the climate nor the digital ones. It was really nothing. At least it was only about the financial sector, which of course affects the whole world. But climate is different, and so is digital. So, and all three major crises of the 21st century require strong governance. What is that governance thing? is not only about processes and tools, there are plenty of them, and we've seen a number of them here. It's also about values, goals, commitment, regulations, compliance, at least. And I'll discuss about those points in more detail. But that's my main messages. Going back to the history, the financial crisis was, to some extent, to a large extent, a regulatory and corporate governance failure. Regulations are playing catch up, and there is no such thing as perfect regulations either, much like there is no such thing as perfect governance. It's only better regulations. And of course, the pendulum swings all the time. We see this in the financial sector. We heard before about Facebook. Facebook is a baby. It's literally not even a baby. Yeah? The financial sector has been struggling with governance and regulations for centuries. So we should look beyond before Facebook. We should look at financial risk management. We mentioned Lee Victor, my co-founder. He's coming from a financial risk management world. That's very, very, very important, because otherwise history repeats. We have to look at that. Pharmacovigilance, I mentioned this in the morning. The pharmacovigilance, the whole, and the pharmaceutical sector, it's much older than Facebook, yeah? Same for auto, same for aviation, same for all other sectors. So we are not new. Let's not do this mistake, because then we will be walking on the same mistakes everybody else has done for tens of years, if not centuries. Very critical. So the financial crisis was a regulatory and corporate governance crisis. Corporate governance can mean 1,000 things. One thing it can capture is the corporate structure. This is the corporate structure of Lehman Brothers. It looks like, oh my God, what's happening here kind of thing. And it collapsed. And how do you govern this? Corporate governance. We know what happened to Lehman Brothers. And guess what happened about 20 years, not 20, 15 years later. This happened 15 years later. This is a corporate governance of SBF. It looks like not only we didn't learn the lesson from history, we are doing worse. Quite impressive. And if I go to law, it's a wonderful article by Andrew Law, L-O, not L-A-O, L-A-W. Andrew Law is a very well-known professor in MIT. He wrote this wonderful article a couple of years ago, 2014, Law as Code, where they're basically representing different laws, their sections, whatever it is, right? Different sections, as graphs and how they are connected. So here you see some examples. It's not simple. Regulation is complex, and of course, because it's solving a complex governance problem. So these are the graphs of different sections of the regulation for the tobacco and the regulation for the student loan transparency laws of 2008 in the US. And guess how the regulation graph looks for the financial sector? That's how it looks like. Literally, that's how it looks like. So if we are complaining about regulatory complexity, it means that we don't have any sense of history. We have to, probably we don't need this, hopefully we don't need this, but it will not be as simple. And it should not be as simple, and it was never simple. Regulatory and corporate governance are not simple. That's why they're difficult to get them right. And at the end, those corporate and regulatory governance challenges, if not done right, lead to major issues. The financial crisis was one of them. Climate change is another one. The planet, who is regulating that, who is governing that, right? Tragedy of the commons kind of issues and things that economists have been talking about for a century or something, if not more. And the same in terms of the digital technologies. It's nice to see the analogy here. Industrial tech led to climate change, physical climate change, 100 years later. Digital tech seems to be leading to the digital climate change, democracy risks, and safety, trust and safety risks. And the parallels are worth noting, both in terms of how things are evolving and lessons learned. And if there is one lesson we know about governance, is that you don't need it until you do. And when you need it, it's usually too late. So you'd better do this before. It's not only about maximizing the upside because of better strategic decisions, but it's a lot more about minimizing the downside. So you see this is a picture of what I'm talking about from my good colleague Ludo van der Heyden, who we are working a lot together on this topic. He has set up the INSEAD Corporate Governance Center about 10 years ago, through which probably each one of us should go through. Already a couple of thousand directors of boards from global companies have passed through his hands, so he's seen quite a bit. And we are now working together on tech governance, which is what we are talking about here. So as you see here, the idea here is good governance is not only about the upside, it's about minimizing and managing the downside. Because when there is a crisis, whether it's a financial crisis, or a geopolitical crisis, or a team crisis, or a BP oil spill crisis, or whatever crisis, a Twitter crisis, and there, this may be controversial, I use this as an example, I'm not having any opinions about this, this comes from the Twitter files, where if you go through the Twitter files, whether they are real or not, that's not my point. You can see the discussions, out of context of course, of people saying, what are we doing here? And these are the people who are in the execution side, not the governance side. Right? Governance is not about execution. The governance is a different story. It's the execution side. Yoel Roth and Vijay, the general counsel of Twitter, before Elon Musk, and the head of trust and safety, before Elon Musk, Yoel, are basically discussing what do we do here. And this is a sign of bad governance. Because one characteristic of good governance at the corporate level is effective and efficient channels of communication from top down all the way to the board, especially for major situations that the organization is struggling with. That's a very important feature of successful corporate governance. And by the way, governance, corporate governance, is not about the board only. It's also about the culture and ability of every single person in the organization and potentially every single stakeholder to have the ability to raise flags from the roots of the organization, grassroots. That's part of governance. How is the organization set up to ensure that grassroots information flows from bottom to top and top to bottom? And if this is not in place, you have people struggling and feeling very lonely during a crisis. And by the way, the governance of Twitter, like any company, is not perfect before Elon Musk. And of course, after Elon Musk, lots of other questions. You cannot have the same person being the CEO, the chairman, and the owner, right? This is like a disaster. And this is just a reference to an article we wrote with Ludo van der Heyden, which you can find on Inside Knowledge, where we lay out some analysis of Twitter's governance based on public sources, of course, before Elon and after Elon, identifying different types of mistakes. Of course, whatever you can identify, and maybe not necessarily all of them true, because it's only based on public sources. For those of you interested, I encourage you to go and take a look at this. Just a bit more deep dive, without spending too much time, because this is, as I mentioned, something that board members come to INSEAD and spend weeks to get familiar with these concepts. So there is no way we can do this in 5 minutes, obviously. This is literally weeks, if not months, over a period of time, over a year or something. They come and go, directors of boards, of like public companies and major, very experienced people, to understand a bit more, not perfectly, never perfectly, it's impossible, the nuances of corporate governance. And just to understand some of the nuances, here are some example complexities and trade-offs, which of course are never perfect and never the same across organizations. Of course, the usual discussion, shareholder versus stakeholders, which is a big deal. Process management versus results management, how to manage the two. Global versus local, tell versus ask. The board telling the CEO, that's what we do, versus the board saying, that's what you do. Suggesting versus asking. Not obvious how to do this, because you don't want to overstep. The governance is not execution. If governance becomes execution, there's a problem, but there's a fine line there. Not obvious how to do this. Short-term versus long-term, profit versus growth, corporate versus business, all to just indicate that it's not simple, but that's what makes it also so important and so difficult. And just to share a framework, and going back to what I said, just to close, it's not only about processes and roles. We talk a lot about processes and tools here, content moderation processes, trust and safety processes, whatever processes. That's of course not enough. It's far from enough. It's also about roles, of course, but before you go there, and we talked about this in the morning, about the OECD AI principles, for those of you who are there, Right? I'm part of the OECD network of experts on AI and been involved in this, in their journey for a number of years now. Before you go there, you have to spend enormous amount of time. The OECD spent 3 years or something to come together with a one-pager, more or less, with 7, 8, I don't remember how many OECD AI principles. And you are looking at this and you're thinking, how can they spend 3 years coming up with those 8 lines? And the answer is, that's what it takes. Because identifying the values that are shared based on the goals you want to achieve, freedom of expression, safety, trust and safety, which by the way, they are very different. Trust and safety are not the same. Trust can be bad for safety. And it's very important we understand this. We wrote an article with my co-author on Harvard Law School at Science Magazine about a year ago, for those of you interested, where we actually highlight this important trap. The fact that I trust something doesn't mean this thing is safe, for example, right? So we have to make sure we understand those nuances, right? And only after you have the goals, values, then you go to process and roles, and you have to ensure commitment, which, by the way, the commitment comes if all the other things are already in place. Because if I don't understand my role, if I don't understand the process, if I don't understand the goal, if I don't understand the value, why should I commit? I don't even know what I commit to. Unless those things are clear, including the buy-in of all the stakeholders, important stakeholders, you cannot get commitment. And without commitment, nothing works in the long term. We are writing another article with Ludo coming out next week, and I mentioned this in the morning, regarding the dangers of global regulatory harmonization, which basically the heart of the argument is, unless there is commitment and values alignment, global regulatory harmonization can prove extremely dangerous. For those of you interested, it will be coming out probably next week or so. So that's what I want to say. Again, there is a lot of things to discuss over here, as you see. As I mentioned, this is probably, in all topics I've seen in my life, the past 25 years, governance is probably the most challenging, nuanced, and difficult one I've seen. I've worked back in the 90s on machine learning algorithms and computer vision algorithms when I was doing my PhD in MIT. I worked over 20 years in INSEAD and across other organizations I've been involved in on business, marketing, finance, hedge funds. I've never seen something so beautiful, important, nuanced, and complex as governance. And unless we understand this, we will never be happy about governance because there is no such thing as perfect governance. And you have to understand this. So just to close, I hope that was worth your time before the drinks. Are we planting the seeds of the next global digital crisis? One thing I'm very much closely following these days is the work of Henry Kissinger. You all know Henry Kissinger? Eric Schmidt, Google, and Daniel Huttelnocher, the director of the MIT School of Computing. Eric Schmidt wrote a nice article about a couple of weeks ago in Foreign Affairs. I posted on my LinkedIn for those of you who want to look for it. And what does Kissinger, Schmidt, and Huttelnocher have in common? Kissinger, you know, it's a 100-year-old person. He was responsible for the China approachment and the wedge between Russia and China back in the 70s, etc., been around forever. He probably met everybody from Mao Zedong to probably Stalin. I don't know if he met Stalin. Probably he did. To everybody else. What do they have in common? They have in common one mission, which is how to avoid an Armageddon, a World War III kind of thing, due or because of or with the power of technology. They wrote a book in the age of AI, where basically they spent big part of the book, even though the title is the age of AI, big part of the book is about online trust and safety. I don't think they refer to that term in the book, but the big part of the book is about AI online and how this affects polarization, radicalization, narrative fallacy, etc. And when you see Henry Kissinger, Eric Schmidt, and Daniel Huttelnocher spending their time the past couple of years, 3-4 years, on this topic, and parenthesis, Eric Schmidt was a chairman of the National Security on AI for the US. NSA, not NSA, National Security Agency, right, but for AI, which was built as a mirror of national security agencies of the US back after World War II. That's how important this committee was. And they came up with some reports that are public. I highly recommend you to look at them. So Eric Schmidt, having spent his time as a chairman of the National Committee, what they say, I forget now, NSA, it's National Security Committee for AI for the US. You can see how these things can all take us down to a rabbit hole that we don't want to go. And the only way around this is proper governance at all levels. And that's why I started by saying, no matter what we do, unless we fix that, nothing else matters. Thank you.
Definitely something to really think about. All right, now they're all switched off. There we go. So really important to think about this and to start looking on how to develop these processes as well as the network to be able to build it, as it is going to take time and energy from all of us to do this. So thank you, Theos, for such a great end to an amazing day. I hope you all enjoyed some of these conversations and discussions today. It's certainly been a long day on my end, but I really appreciate everybody being here, spending the time, taking time off, preparing for your presentations and your panel discussions. I think it just shows the commitment that we have for trust and safety here in Europe, and building the Trust and Safety Forum as that venue to be able to have conversations in the next few years and beyond. So with that, I don't see Jean-Christophe in the room, so he may be already in the drinking area waiting to welcome us. But on his behalf and mine, I really want to thank you again. And I want to thank AWS and Julie for hosting this evening's cocktail hour, which if you go out of here, turn right, go down the small stairs, and it's the yellow area square that's in Le Square, which is way too confusing. But you'll see it's right there in the yellow, we'll all can just continue the conversations, meet other people that we haven't had time to talk to yet, and enjoy the beautiful weather as well. So I will see you there shortly.